The views expressed and opinions given by the individual hosts and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Z-Talk Radio, its affiliates, or sponsors.
You're listening to the Dark Shadows Radio, live from Odin Studios in the Canadian desert of Kelowna, British Columbia, with your host, Al Warren, only on the Z-Talk Radio Network.
Thank you for joining us in the Dark Shadows. I'm Al Warren. Tonight on our first episode, we have Dr. Peter Vronsky. Now, he's a Canadian author, a filmmaker, and an investigative historian. Now, he holds a PhD in criminal justice history and espionage, and at the University of Toronto in Canada. Now, he's written a bestseller in the true crime history. It's called Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters, and Female Serial Killers, How and Why Women Become Monsters. And now what I find most exciting about talking to Peter is that he was the first reporter granted access into Russia to investigate Lee Harvey Oswald after the shooting of Kennedy. Very, very cool subject. We'll be talking to him a lot about that and his books and everything else going on in life right after these words.
My name is Tyler Oakley. I know y'all got crazy busy days. Honestly, the only way I can ever get through a crazy day is with some coffee. Thankfully, Starbucks has these brand new mini frappuccinos. Can we talk about how cute these are? That are the perfect size. Whether you are just starting your crazy day or you're halfway through and you need that pick-me-up, they are ideal. Actually, adorable. I know, we have all been there where you're trying to decide between two flavors, and honestly, how can you pick between perfection and perfection? Well, now you can get two without feeling guilty. I know, you're welcome in advance.
I'm really psyched Subway's bringing the flavor with this new guacamole for a couple of reasons. First, people really love our guacamole. Rich and creamy, made from Hass avocados and just a hint of jalapeno to keep it interesting. The other reason is, it's just really fun to say. Guacamole.
Guacamole.
Guacamole. Guacamole. Guacamole. Guacamole. See?
Come in and try our new guacamole on sandwiches like the Chipotle Chicken Melt and discover how it turns up the flavor on all your favorite sandwiches.
Subway. Eat fresh.
I said I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. I said I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
No smoking in this building.
What are you gonna do? Charge me with smoking?
You better start packing a handgun.
Throw me a frickin' bone here. I'm the boss. Need the info.
We're back, and joining us, Peter Vronsky. It's been quite a... this is pretty exciting for me. I've been really looking forward to this. So let's start out with thank you for joining us on the show.
Oh, Alan, thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's just a pleasure. Let's start out with where you got into history and true crime. Like, where did it start for you?
History, true crime. I guess every crime is a history, in itself. There's a kind of a chronology and narrative to it, and I suppose most history that we read is, criminal narrative anyway, right? Every great historic event is usually somehow associated with violence, and often illegal or unauthorized violence and aggression. So I think history and true crime are really one and the same thing. Ever since I was a kid, I'm fascinated with the time period that I was growing up in and the recent past. I was born in the mid-1950s, so I kind of grew up in the wake of the Second World War, which was a huge, phenomenal change in, I think, our civilization. So being born about 10 years after that, we look at it now, it's 70, 80 years in the past, but being born 10 years after it, it was a historical period. So I think a lot of people born in that period probably have a fascination with history. I didn't become a historian. I ended up working first as a cameraman for television news, actually recording history. And this would have been in the 1970s. And of course, at that time, we were believing that the future of history, that history is going to be no longer written by people or by men, women, but it'll be recorded by machines. And so it was natural for me to, after working a summer recording history as a cameraman, to not return back in my third year back to college in some lecture hall listening to some professor droning on, so I figured I'll go back a year later or 2 years later. And it was, at least 30 years before I ever went back to take a college course again. I just stayed in the television business and the film business. I produced documentaries, worked for television news, traveled the world, and wound up on the internet streaming video in the early 2000s and crash and burned in the dot-com crash, 2000, 2001. And the only options I had, and I had kids by then, the only options I had was to go back, to shooting news again or producing documentaries. And of course, it was post 9/11, and the kind of offers I was getting was, you want to go to Afghanistan, you want to go to Iraq. And I did a lot of undercover investigative work prior. In the 90s, in Russia, up in Chechnya, in South Africa. So that's what my specialty was. But now my kids, they were adolescents. I already had 4 decades on me. I didn't want to go back to that. And so the only thing left for me to do at this point was take the refuge of scoundrels. I went to grad school. I got a fellowship where they give you actually a little bit of money to go study. It becomes like a job for you to study. It's not a huge job, a huge paying job, but it's a job. And I got my PhD. I spent 10 years studying criminal justice history and the history of espionage in international relations. Those are my two fields. And as I get into grad school, a book that I had tried to publish about 4 years ago suddenly got picked up and published. And so it's almost like as I entered grad school, I'm suddenly a published writer. I never intended to write. I always was a filmmaker, and any writing I did as a filmmaker, was formal writing like proposals, promo material, or a script. But I never really, wrote a book until I wrote my first book, which was a history of serial killers, of serial homicide, a book called Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters. So there's the capsule bio CV.
And so in your early days in the 70s, so when you were doing like films, you were more on the documentary side, right? Like
that's right.
Like Ramones and Dead Voice.
Yes.
CBGG. So kind of what was the turning point for you? Like was there like any director or other people you worked with in the 70s that sort of influenced you to?
Well, there were directors that influenced me, not ones that I had worked with, because essentially often I was the director too, right? But there were directors, of course, American directors, and some Canadian ones who influenced me. Certainly Martin Scorsese at that point was already at the height of my pantheon, because when I started making films, Mean Streets had already come out. And Taxi Driver was just coming. And I was just anticipating to see Taxi Driver on the basis of his film Mean Streets. And so, when you think of Scorsese today, and you think that Taxi Driver was only his second popular film. He made several others. There were, this is one Hollywood film, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which really he did as a kind of traffic cop director. It wasn't his film, but Mean Streets was his film. And I was so impressed by the film, by its editing, by its style, by, how he uses music in it. Was just this most amazing film. And when Taxi Driver came out, that just blew me away, And of course then comes Raging Bull, but by then I'm a filmmaker already. Coppola, of course, The Godfather had already came out. Billy Friedkin, The Exorcist, and French Connection. And these were films that had a documentary style to them in the sense of how they kind of built this authenticity. From documentaries, of course, I was very much aware of the Maisley brothers and Fred Wiseman. The idea of embedding yourself. His film High School and Basic Training had already, I think Basic Training had already been out, Salesman, where he lives with his subject. So that's how, when I started making documentaries, like, for example, that punk rock documentary, I would essentially embed myself. And some of them I made undercover, people who I filmed, who thought they were being filmed for completely different purposes other than for those that I was, filming. Because of course I would bring in cameras, there were no such things as miniature cameras, so you had to come in and show the camera, but you had to come in with a story, an undercover story that allowed you to have that camera out where normally cameras would not be allowed.
Yeah. But that's the ultimate. That's got to be the ultimate in film work, right? That you can get people's natural reactions.
Yes, and people get used to cameras very quickly. You don't need to hide a camera. And then I'm talking, this isn't on the same day, but if you film people for a day or two, after a day or two, you can have a huge camera on your shoulder, and video cameras in those days were. And you're invisible. You're a fly on the wall. People eventually forget you're there. So, yeah, exactly. You become invisible.
It's a good thing. Now, what really caught me was Okay, so Mondo Moscow. So that really was about Stalinism, culture, and you also investigated someone that we've talked about a lot on this show, Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yes.
I think it's amazing that you actually got to interview with friends and acquaintances and lovers and stuff.
Yeah.
How was that for you?
It was life-changing in a great way, because, you know, in Russia, when I did this, I was the first one to interview those people, since the KGB had interviewed them back in the 60s, immediately after the assassination. The Warren Commission had asked permission from the Soviet Union to interview Russian citizens. They were turned down. The House committee hearings asked permission. They were turned down. Researchers, historians, journalists had all asked permission. They were turned down. And so I arrived just at the perfect timing when I put in my request, as Gorbachev had come to power and as things were opening in Russia. It was still a communist regime there. This was prior to the coup. But when I put in my request, it was approved. And so I went in, and many of these people were absolutely in a state of trauma, almost, talking about this, because they were dying to talk about this for decades. And of course, they were warned in '63, in November, they were warned by Soviet police and the KGB that if they ever talk about their relationship or about Lee Harvey Oswald, just bring up his name, they're going to be in, in serious shit, right? And of course, when you live in a regime like that, even though things are now democratized, you're still afraid of what might happen tomorrow. And so these people were relieved in one way that they were able to unburden themselves and tell their story for the first time. And some were happy, some were, like I said, a little bit traumatized by it. But it was really amazing how, after I had done this, they were interviewed over the next following years by ABC TV. I think went in next, 2020, about 3-4 months after I did. They went in. And then other documentary crews went in, and how their stories began to change from the ones that they had first told me on their first day. How their memories even began to, as people were bringing them Kennedy books and conspiracy literature, because none of them had read any of this, because first of all, it wasn't available in Russia, and secondly, it was prohibited in Russia anyway. So people's memories were completely untouched by other like juries are supposed to be kept clear of any kind of influence.
Right.
All right. In that same way. So it was interesting to talk. It was like those the prehistoric mammoths they find in ice from 10,000 years ago, and there's still, the mammoth has all its meat on it and its fur that was just frozen in a glacial ice. It was like unmelting the Kennedy assassination in this glacial iceberg. The one place where no one had yet touched it, I was like in virgin territory, the last Rosetta Stone, the last place no one had gone into yet. The Russian witnesses, what did they have to say? And I got so close to Lee Harvey Oswald that I actually started finding stuff he left behind there. So I found photographs of him there, which I brought back, books that he had with inscriptions. All those things were still left behind. Audio tapes he had made, and just things that I was able to check off because of course he had a diary that he called his historic diary that no one is sure. Most people believe that he wrote it in just a few settings and might have been writing it on a ship coming back from Europe to New York in '62 when he returned. And so I was able to check things up against his diary, and of course in the Warren Commission exhibits is his address book from Russia, right? So in fact, what I gave the Russians when they said yes, I gave them photocopies of the address book, his Russian address book as it appears in the Warren Commission exhibit books. And many of the people were still living at that same address because people in Russia don't exactly move around, from apartment to apartment. So, when I looked at all the conspiracy stuff, especially just the 2 years that he was living in Russia, written about why he was there, what he was doing there, about all those people that he was in contact with, the Cubans, the KGB, Minsk, the language school, him being tracking U-2s on radar at Atsugi, Japan, right, what he might have brought to Russia and so forth. When I looked at all that was written about that, it was such bullshit that I was just devastated, because I absolutely was raised on this belief that Lee Harvey Oswald could not have done it alone, that there was a conspiracy. Of course there was a conspiracy, and there was never any doubt in my mind. And I was absolutely positive that what I would find in Russia was maybe the nature of Lee Harvey Oswald's mission there, And instead I found, why Lee Harvey Oswald went to Russia? Why he went there?
No.
Because he wanted to write a book when he comes back. He went there to write a book. Lee Harvey Oswald wanted to be a writer, and I don't understand why nobody has said that the reason he killed Kennedy was because this guy was dyslexic and wanted to be a writer, without word processing existing. It's as simple as that. But Lee Harvey Oswald went to Russia to see what life is like there, to write a book, and the first thing he does when he comes back, he hires a stenographer and starts dictating his book to her. He gets to, I think, like page 20, and then he runs out of money for the stenographer. He can't pay her anymore. And if you read the book, if you read Oswald's manuscript written by a stenographer instead of his dyslexic own hand, you realize that this guy is capable of writing. He's not a brilliant writer. He's not a talented writer. He may not be even a great writer, but he is an adequate writer. He could write a magazine article. If Lee Harvey Oswald was alive in '68, he'd probably be, if he only stayed in New York. If he stayed in New York, Lee Harvey Oswald would have fit into the hippie movement. He would have hit the anti-war movement. When Vietnam came, nobody would be looking at Oswald as a freak for his, hands-off Cuba demonstrations.
Right.
Oswald would have been alive and thriving, and maybe today he'd be a senior editor at Rolling Stone, or the Village Voice.
Yeah.
So
then how do you feel about all of the people that come out now and saying that? Well, you see, because in general, it seems like a lot of what I get from books tend to, and authors, they tend to be aiming LBJ behind the killing of Kennedy. It seems to be a majority of them. It's not all of them, but so where does that take it? Do you think he was just not involved with anybody? He did this completely on his own in his own.
He did this completely on his own. I'm sure there were ongoing conspiracies to kill President Kennedy at that time, and that some of these conspiracies were serious. And I think what's confusing us is all the noise coming off these conspiracies. Oswald was not a part of any of those conspiracies. Oswald did not play nice with others, nor was he that naive to be completely manipulated in that way. Oswald had a pathology, an unstable pathology, and Oswald, of course, Oswald is kind of a rampage serial killer in a way, because he first takes a shot of General Walker. We always forget about that, and only Walker walks away only because Oswald missed. And so then on the day he shoots Kennedy, Oswald also kills a police officer later that day. So he's like I said, he's gone off the bend on a rampage. I found out that Oswald was making pipe bombs in Russia, and I found that extraordinarily strange. And of course, he had a license to have a shotgun in Russia, and so those pipe bombs are serious because he would have been using the powder from the shotgun shells as the accelerant in the pipe bombs. And the fittings he got from work because he worked as a millwright in a radio factory. He milled parts, so he's got, so what the hell was that all about?
Well, and what was his point there? So he was going there to write a book and get an experience. That's all great. But what was Russia's point? Because that was a very dark time. Russia was not very open, and especially to Americans.
No, but there were defectors there, and the Russians didn't want him. The Russians wanted to expel him at the end of the week. And then Oswald stages this it's not suicide, he cuts his wrists dramatically. He stages this dramatic cutting incident. He's hospitalized. And so the Russians decide they'll let him stay a year rather than have some, huge issue of a guy cutting his wrists or dying there on them. It's possible that they were going to try to fish his military experience at Sugi from him. That's maybe why they wanted to hang on to him. The stuff that came out of the KGB archives indicates that somehow the KGB failed to assess Oswald's Marine credentials. And I think that's a possibility because, everybody talks about the KGB. And of course the KGB had undergone, quote, reform after, and then we realized there was no reform, and now it's split into two agencies and so forth. And, there was a while where you can actually take tours of KGB headquarters the way you could take tours at one time of FBI headquarters, right? But nobody talks about the GRU. You see, the GRU underwent no reform, the military intelligence. And the GRUs had held no public tours. And the GRU is part of the military-industrial complex in Russia, and still is today. And the GRU did not open its archives. They're untouchable. And what Oswald was doing would have been of greater interest to the GRU than it would be to the KGB. So we don't know yet just what the Russians were getting out of Oswald. But Oswald wanted to be enrolled in Moscow University in the Patrice Lumumba University there. He wanted to go to college there. And of course the Russians replied to him, well, you're a little unstable. And first of all, you didn't quite graduate high school. And thirdly, Patrice Lumumba University is for third world students only. And so instead of you staying here in Moscow, we're going to send you to a factory in Minsk, right? Oh, you were a radar operator? Great. You'll be working in a radio factory. And you'll be milling parts. So he gets a great apartment. He gets a nice subsidy there. And, life under communism was very sweet in Russia. People over there, the grass looks always greener. When I was there, on other people's lawns, because when I was there and I was looking at people, right, in the kinds of apartments they were living, and they were complaining to me, and I was saying, hey, how much are you paying? You're making, say, you're making $350 a month, but you're paying $4 for this apartment. And I would be making maybe $1,200 a month, but I would be paying $1,600 for this apartment in Toronto, or $2,500 in New York. You don't realize how good of a pad you have. Some of the places that people were living in were stunning, what they had. Especially, look at Moscow and Leningrad. I know as you get out into the countryside and out to Siberia, it's all these prefab, crumbling, badly made housing and so forth. But I've seen, he got a nice place.
So he did well.
He did well, and of course women, just, if you're a foreigner, women just throw yourself.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a good-looking guy. Women throw yourself at you simply because you're sober and you had a bath.
Yeah.
Because you got to remember that the Russians, especially when Oswald arrives there, had gone through a Holocaust. More people were killed in the Second World War in Russia, right, than anywhere else. Even the Chinese did not have the kind of casualties that the Russians had. The Germans, the Nazis, went in there and they were going to kill every Russian and Ukrainian and White Russian, every Slav west of the Ural Mountains, as much as they were going to kill any Jew they can lay their hands on. Right? After the Jews, it would have been the Russians and the Ukrainians next up on the line. So there were not a lot of men left there. So you come in, like Lee Harvey Oswald, he had choice of women that it was like being in a candy store for him.
Yeah.
In that first year, he fell in love. I met the woman with whom he had fallen in love before Marina. And he met Marina in April of 1961. In December of 1960, he proposed marriage to this woman. And Oswald's plans at that point was not to go back to the United States, but to go on to Hungary. He was getting disillusioned with living in Russia. He was getting disillusioned with kind of some of the hypocrisy, which you got to remember, he was very young. Oswald was only 19 years old when he arrived in Moscow. He was a teenage defector. We forget how young Oswald is. He's only 24 when he's killed. Right. We look at him; he looks like a 30-year-old, and he goes, he goes through profound physical deterioration between 19 and 24, and I think partly his disillusionment and the collapse of his marriage, his mental instability. He's not very stable. He's got a very neurotic mother. He, like I say, I sometimes describe Lee Harvey Oswald as an incipient serial killer because he has some of those elements in his family history, the absence of a father figure, rejection, instability, trauma, violent disposition. We don't know if he was cruel to animals and whether he set fires or whether he wet his bed. And there is nothing on there on the historical record. Just came back, and when I saw how much of the conspiracy literature was absolute nonsense, and those 3 shots, anybody who shoots, God, those are, my grandmother could make that shot. that there's any absolute question about that shot being physically possible? Are you kidding me? You could do that shot blindfolded. Not only has he had this rifle, has been practicing with it for months. By the way, I had conversations with Marina as well, because I put Marina in touch with her family for the first time, because I met her aunt and her uncle. I was the last person to ever see her, the famous KGB uncle who was supposed to have been recruiting Oswald, right? He wasn't in the KGB, just such bullshit, right? Yeah. I met him, and so, I spoke with Marina afterwards, and he practiced with this rifle. He's got a little sniper's nest. The rifle is nicely settled on these boxes that he has there. The distance is only the distance of a football field, and the target is moving slowly away from him. It's not even like he has to lead the target that's coming across, and he's got a scope. And of course, the first shot, he starts off with a round inside the chamber. He's only got to reload it twice. Come on, all right. It's an easy shot, and the whole thing, the magic bullet. Excuse me, I've seen bullets do magic things every day. I was with a guy who got shot straight in the head with an AK-47 round. A cameraman. The bullet hit him square in the forehead, and then instead of going through the forehead, it follows the curve of his skull, underneath his scalp, between the camera, the scalp, and the bone, and travels to the back of his head, just underneath the scalp, and drops out harmlessly out down his neck. Talk to me about magic bullets.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Bullets do magic things. And of course, the whole thing about that jump seat being not in exactly the lying position, right, directly behind or in front of Kennedy, right, the positioning of the jump seat, all bullshit, magic bullet, and the pristine bullet, right, all you have to do is look at the photographs of the damn thing on its vertical, and the bullet is flattened. There's nothing pristine about it. So I was so, when I went back and I saw the bullshit on the Russian thing, having actually walked into that world and walked into a glacial iceberg of that world. And then from there, when I started looking at everything else, all the other things, obviously Oswald did it. And damn, the Warren Commission report was so closer to the truth as far as Russia went, as far as what they found. And the diaries Oswald had were way much more accurate than ever anybody had said when I started fact-checking them there exactly. So people don't read often that it needs to be reread. Yeah, it was a sloppy investigation. Yeah, absolutely could have been done better. And nutbar Ruby didn't help it either. Right? That's where the mythology begins. Right? Had Oswald not been murdered by Jack Ruby, because then the moment Ruby does is it's like a gathering of eagles, except they're all crazy, all right? The moment Ruby does what he does, it now becomes mythology.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think the point was? But why did Oswald want to kill Kennedy?
I think Oswald killed Kennedy for the same reason that John Lennon was killed. Because Kennedy disillusioned Oswald with his phoniness. I think when Oswald was hanging out in New Orleans after he took that shot at Walker and missed, and of course he left Marina that letter, the "Goodbye, I'm dead now" letter. Warren Commission Exhibit number 1. right? The Warren Commission, the 26 volumes begin with exhibit number 1 is the letter that Oswald leaves Marina that she finds when she comes home, right? He just had gone off to shoot Walker, and he's assuming that after he shoots him that he's going to be arrested or killed. So, and Marina now tells him, you got to get out of town, and she sends him to New Orleans, which I confirm because I find Marina's letters to her aunt before the assassination, like glacial ice as well, sitting in Russia. So I can check. When people say Marina is lying, I had Marina's letters from 62, 63 to her aunt. Her aunt shared with me the letters. So I can double check Marina's testimony about the chronology and things before it all happened, before the assassination. So Oswald is in New Orleans, and I don't know the Camp connection, the David Ferry connection, the Camp Street connection, all that. That's all very interesting. I think Oswald is drawn onto the periphery of those people, as I have been on peripheries of groups like that. I think Oswald fantasized of maybe becoming an agent. His favorite TV show was I Lived 3 Lives. So I think Oswald perhaps fantasized it and wanted to be a police informant, a police agent, a secret agent. I think he was an adventurer. It was an adventurous thing joining the Marines. And it was an adventurous thing to become a teenage defector. He probably heard what happened at the Bay of Pigs. And he probably heard about ZR rifle. And he probably heard about the assassination attempts on Kennedy. And I think Oswald, because of his, uncle's mob connections, might have had some ear on, guys who were connected in the mob world. Might have heard from those places too. So Oswald, from what Russians were telling me, is after Oswald was in Russia when Kennedy was elected, and Oswald spoke very highly of Kennedy and was very, very complimentary of Kennedy and admiring of Kennedy, and saw Kennedy as this new wind coming into the White House, because Oswald, of course, defects during the Eisenhower years, during the Republican Party years. Yeah. So that above everything suggests to me that, who's the guy who shot Lennon? His name just
Chapman.
Yeah. That he gets into that Chapman frame of mind, that Kennedy's a phony. And Oswald wants to change history. Oswald wants to he has a objective sense of history. And he's talking about this with Marina. He's talking with Marina before he shoots Walker, whether if someone had killed Hitler, if that would have been a good thing. Well, Hitler was still a young, rising politician. And Marina tells him, you can't make that kind of decision. You can't decide that. You can't kill people. But Oswald is thinking about it. And then, of course, oddly enough, those audio tapes that Oswald recorded in Russia, in one segment of the audio tapes, Oswald records a fake press interview with a Russian friend. This is in English. And the press interview, he's an assassin. And he has just shot a right-wing general as a political statement. And of course, that's exactly what 18 months later, after he makes that recording, he's going to try to do. He's going to try to shoot this general who's fired, right? Walker is fired because he's distributing in NATO right-wing propaganda that's not government approved. And so Walker now retires and leads this right-wing movement, and Oswald had been already fantasizing about shooting. He might have been actually thinking of Walker. I never checked the chronology of this, is whether Oswald would have been aware of Walker being fired, and whether this is actually who Oswald is thinking when he's making that audio tape. The tapes are made in the Minsk language school, where they have, audio facilities. And, you have all those little violent incidences in Oswald's life, him lunging at his sister-in-law with a knife when he's a kid, his juvenile delinquency, his truancy, him trying to bust open a store shop window to steal stuff. He's an unstable kid.
Yeah, good candidate. Well, I think of recent, with the Warren Commission, it's a lot of it's because, they base it on Alan Dulles being on the Warren Commission, and he was fired, right? So that's a good way of basing that. Why would he be on there?
Well, he was fired. I mean, he wasn't really fired. People say he was always fired, but he was kind of, quote, retired. And I think both the Dulles, by then John Foster Dulles had died. And of course, I think it was a question of law firms too, because of course Alan and John Foster Dulles were actually the infiltration point inside the U.S. government by the firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. Because this is where Sullivan and Cromwell, which has been basically governing corporate and intelligence policy since the Panama Canal, since Teddy Roosevelt period, when William Nelson Cromwell went down there and bagged uprising in Colombia, which becomes suddenly Panama with the United States Marines, and then the Panama Canal Zone and the canal, right? But Sullivan and Cromwell and their connections with the OSS and the Nazi Party, all those things reached their heyday with, of course, the Dulleses coming into the White House under Eisenhower. So, it makes sense that Alan Dulles would be on that commission as the last go-to guy at the CIA. Right? Of course, when somebody wants to know if Oswald was a CIA operative, they would, of course, go to Alan and ask, can you ask your ex-employers if he was? Of course, this problem. The Warren Commission, its purpose, of course, was to verify that Oswald was. That's the problem. Their purpose was to verify that Oswald was alone, and that's not a very good way to conduct an investigation. Nonetheless, it doesn't nullify that Oswald was alone. But what it nullifies is the kind of what we can say, the credibility of the investigation that was supposed to assure people that there wasn't a conspiracy there. I think the conspiracy theorists are doing us a great disfavor. That's the ultimate conspiracy, that it was a conspiracy. Because there is a school of people now, I think, that are beginning to look at that question, that if Oswald actually did it, then why? And what does that mean? Because the message the conspiracy theorists tell us is that ordinary people cannot take down a Caesar among his bodyguards, in his throngs. Only great other powers can only be the Masons, the Zionists, the Mafia, the secret Illuminati, aliens from outer space, the CIA, the KGB. It can't be an ordinary citizen acting on his own will to change history. Impossible. And I think that's the greatest line. It can be. And Oswald, I think, was such a person, and will continue to ignore the possibility that he did it alone, then we're having problems here, because we are ignoring that if he did it alone, what took him to do it, and why.
Well, people don't want to believe that because they don't want to. It makes us feel weak or vulnerable.
Well, hey, if people actually believe that, Bush would not be walking around, right? You know, I mean, guys like you and I would be starting, cleaning at a rifle, right? That's the problem. That's the ultimate act of repression. Conspiracy theory is actually what is driving the obedience industry. What is knuckling us down to be obedient. As long as we believe that nothing can be changed unless great powers change them, then we remain these obedient victims, and we consider ourselves victims of conspiracies that do not exist. You know how conspiracies work? People of just like-minded disposition look the other way. It's not doing things. It's not people coming together. It's people with common interest understanding that they need to look in another direction. And that's all. They don't do anything.
And have you read or heard of the Judith Baker?
Yes, the name you're talking about, the mafia girlfriend.
Yeah, it's the girlfriend that was.
Yes. Yeah.
And kind of do you have thoughts on that, or?
Tell me again. Her premise is.
Well, she was apparently having an affair with him. At the time, with Lee Harvey.
No, with Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah. She was having an affair with him, while, he was married and stuff back in the States. And she was sleeping with him on the side.
Yes.
And she went to a few parties with him and things like that. But her theory was that he didn't do it, and that he loved Kennedy, and he would have never done it.
Well, he might have spoken that way when she did. What was the chronology? When was she? Where was she dating him? In New Orleans or in?
Yeah, in New Orleans.
Well, that makes sense because Marina wasn't living there for a time.
Right. Yeah.
Right. He would have been alone there. He was an attractive guy, and he was very articulate. If you hear the Stuckey radio interviews with Oswald, he's very quick on his feet. He's a great interviewer. Great interview. You would love to have him on your show.
Yeah.
So he's articulate, he's smart. His problem is he's dyslexic. So it's possible that at that moment, he might not have yet met the Cubans. He's just arriving in New Orleans. It's possible, because if she says that, she would be saying the same thing that the Russians said to me.
Yeah.
But that doesn't exclude him, of course, from not doing it.
Right. I mean, that's just an opinion, of course.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean,
so it's possible. It's possible. Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah. It's just there's but things like that kind of help with the conspiracy.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah. Of course. It's a huge. It's a huge industry. It's a huge culture. It is a culture. It's a very reassuring one because. It relieves us of responsibility to act. If we want to change society, we have to act. And so conspiracy theories, they relieve us of that responsibility, because we can now just remain passive because we have decided we're victims of a conspiracy. And we're powerless against the great. How can we go up against the CIA, that can assassinate a president? Only the mafia can. Only the Illuminati can. Oswald did it. He changed history as he wanted to. What I don't understand, actually maybe I do, why Oswald absolutely kept denying that he had done it. And so I don't think he did it for self-aggrandizement. Yeah. I think he did it to change history. And I think he would have probably, if he read Hitler's biographies, which apparently, he had read Mein Kampf that year. They had, the books he was borrowing from the library. If he had read Hitler's biography, he would have known that, of course, that beer hall putsch, that the trial was what began Hitler's career in his public acknowledgement in Germany. Nobody had heard of Hitler until 1923. He was operating in Munich. He was like a local guy. If it was the United States, he would have been like a state politician, a state figure. He would be known in the state of Florida or something. He was a Bavarian politician. He wasn't national. And that beer hall putsch wasn't an attempt to overthrow Germany. It was just an attempt to overthrow the state government in Bavaria. So it's the trial in Bavaria that puts Hitler into newspapers around the rest of Germany, in Berlin, in Dresden, in Hamburg. There, the people for the first time start becoming aware of Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, and the swastika. So Oswald would have been aware of how important the trial might have been and his ability to speak at that trial. And he would have spoken well. He was an articulate speaker.
So he might have got a trial out of it, but he was killed.
But Ruby comes in and does what he does. Crazy Ruby. I mean, Ruby's crazy. When you read his testimony afterwards, about the gas chambers and Jews being murdered on the second floor of the Dallas police headquarters. I mean, the guy's stark raving nutters. His violent disposition. And just how he's there that morning. I mean, he's there to send... What kind of conspiracy is this? If he's there to send money to a stripper, to a stranded stripper. That's the only reason he's there. And he brings his dogs with him, his dachshunds, his precious little dogs.
Yeah.
But that's, and of course, that's like that. It's amazing mathematics, right? If you couldn't write stuff like this. And of course, it immediately, because it's so crazy, it immediately projects it into mythology. I mean, there's no history dissertation on the Kennedy assassination. Historian cannot do that. I mean, you could do some history dissertation on, the Kennedy assassination in media or ballistics in the Kennedy, all the, little components of it. But in terms of if you were to write a history of that event, you couldn't do it. Because it would be like writing about, Jesus' ministry or something like that. It's in the realm of myth now.
Yeah.
Already within our own lifetimes.
Yeah, it sort of captivated the world for a long time.
And will continue so. And once those people die, the last of the witnesses and then the last of the paperwork is going to be released, and we'll see there's nothing in there other than perhaps privacy issues. It'll be forever myth. How great powers, secret powers that really ruled the world, removed the president. I like my favorite myth is number 532, that Kennedy was assassinated to prevent the expansion of the war because Kennedy was planning to, withdraw troops. I mean, it was on Kennedy's watch that American troop strength in Vietnam rose tenfold and was going to rise another tenfold. Yeah, Kennedy made a threat before he allowed Thieu to be murdered, that if Thieu didn't, handle more softly the Buddhists, right? That he was going to withdraw military support. How that becomes a myth that Kennedy was going to be withdrawing troops and getting out of the Vietnam War, and LBJ wanted to persecute this war. LBJ was a great humanitarian. My God, LBJ, I feel so sad for LBJ because he did so many things that Kennedy only talked. LBJ walked the walk. I mean, the civil rights legislation, the Great Society, poor LBJ, that Kennedy shat out Vietnam into his lap, and that LBJ had to sit his presidency, or on the record of Vietnam, of that catastrophe. That Kennedy and the Dulles brothers and Eisenhower really cooked up. I don't even blame Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy is as evil as the Dulleses. I mean, the Dulleses bring to the United States the end of Marine doctrine and replace it with clandestine doctrine. Up to Truman, if you needed to solve a foreign policy problem, you sent in the Marines. Once Dulles comes into the White House on Eisenhower's administration, both John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, you no longer send in the Marines, you now send in the CIA. And it's all part of a huge program, right, called the New Look. Eisenhower brings on the New Look. And part of the New Look, one, is no more American boots on the ground. From now on, the South Koreans are going to be fighting their own war, because this is now, in the wake of the Korean War. Eisenhower kind of winds that up. It was Truman's war. No more American boys overseas. Germans are going to defend Germany. The South Koreans are going to defend South Korea. We will sink money into weapons technology, where we will give them air support, aircraft carriers, nuclear weapons, Air Force. We'll build bases around the world, but boys on the ground, no. Technology, Navy, Air Force. And the first foreign policy problem that they face is Mossadegh in Iran, as Mossadegh is nationalizing British petroleum in Iran. And British Petroleum comes running to Sullivan and Cromwell, because BP is Sullivan and Cromwell's client, as every major corporation at that point is. And now Sullivan and Cromwell have two of their senior partners, now ex-partners, in the White House, two brothers, one Allen, the director of the CIA, John Foster, the president's right-hand man, the Secretary of State. And BP wants that oil, and the deal they make is the United States will help. And what BP really wanted was the U.S. Marines to go in there. And the deal was our monopoly on that oil, we'll now share it with American companies, because Americans have no in Iran. They only had it in Saudi Arabia, because the Americans went in fresh into Saudi Arabia. And that's what was Mossadegh's problem with BP, because Mossadegh, Iran, made the deal with BP 50 years earlier, and it was still like a colonial, imperialist era deal. But the Saudis made their deal with the United States in the late 30s, early 40s. And the Saudi deal was much better than what the Iranians had from 50 years before. So that's why Mossadegh goes after BP in Iran. He wants a better deal. And so now the American companies see this, and all those American companies are clients of Sullivan and Cromwell as well. So Sullivan and Cromwell basically now negotiates the clandestine operations in the same way as the old founder of Sullivan and Cromwell, William Nelson Cromwell, did back in the Panama zone. So no more Marines, New Look, nuclear weapons. That's when they start pumping money into clandestine services, and they succeed. Next, they go into Guatemala, and now it starts. And so Kennedy, of course, that's the Republican Party thing. And so Kennedy, when he comes into power, right? Kennedy likes this, but now Kennedy militarizes this. It's Kennedy who now starts thinking, well, we should bring back the Marines, military, not intelligence, especially after the Bay of Pigs. Because Kennedy, what Kennedy didn't like, I think, was the relationship between organized crime and the CIA. And of course, because Kennedy's father was mobbed up, Kennedy the son probably had insight into how the mob was working and how the partnership between the mob and intelligence agencies developed during the Second World War, right? And so what Kennedy wanted, I think, was to now have a clean military arm, and thus we get the Green Berets, we get clandestine services, we get anti-guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency, which is Kennedy's Democratic Party's new look, you know. So it's all those assassination attempts on Castro. We forget that they don't come from Kennedy and the two Kennedys. They're already underway under Eisenhower. So the Kennedys just inherited, and they hang on to it. You know, they hang on to it. They have no problems. They'll keep it going, and now Kennedy starts augmenting it with a military arm, the clandestine arm, Green Berets. So Kennedy, he was committed to stopping communism, containing it in Vietnam, and he would have thrown a lot of clandestine operations and irregular counterinsurgency at Vietnam, and I guess LBJ didn't understand that. LBJ saw it as a kind of more in the Truman kind of way. Send in the Marines, send in mass troops, conventional war. That's that wrecks his reputation.
Oh yeah.
You LBJ presidents, they know they're just puppets. You don't. If you're a vice president and you want to get something done, God, the last thing you become is a president.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. I think it's even worse now. But
for sure.
So many hands there.
Yeah.
And now you've gone into. Well, not gone into, but it's quite a while ago. But so you started with the serial killer books.
Yes, yeah. In '90, I wrote, because I met two serial killers, encountered them.
Oh.
One, I guess you didn't read my book.
No, I was going to say.
Well, my first book begins with my account of the chapter's called My Two Serial Killers. How I randomly, in my travels, encountered two serial killers. One before the word serial killer had been coined publicly, which means that I encountered something that I didn't know was a serial killer, that I didn't have a concept of what that would entail. It would have been a Alfred Hitchcock movie-type monster, because Frenzy, for example, Psycho are all movies that came out before the word serial killer was around. So we had different names for them, but no one really settled on a name. And of course, until you have a name for it, as the Bible says first there was the word, and so we didn't have that word. We had no concept of what they were. So 1979, as I was trying to check into a hotel in New York City, I briefly encountered a serial killer fleeing the scene of a double homicide he had just committed, carrying the two heads of his victims in a bag.
Oh.
And I hadn't realized that's what I had encountered, first of all. For me, it was just this guy annoying me on the elevator because he was holding up the elevator, who banged me with what I thought were a bag of bowling balls.
Yeah. Did you
when I went up, he had left behind, he had lured two prostitutes off Times Square into his room where he had raped and tortured them to death, one at a time. And then he beheaded them and chopped their hands off, and as he was leaving, he soaked them in lighter fluid and set their bodies on fire. And then he must have held the elevator up to ensure that the fire has taken hold. And as he's holding that elevator up, I'm in the lobby being annoyed by why is that elevator being held up, because I'm trying to decide whether I want to check into this hotel, and I'm going to take a walk through the hotel to see how bad is this place really. And so when the elevator comes down, I even give him a very hard look as to who's this asshole who's making me wait another 20 seconds for the elevator. All right. And when I go up there, I decide when I get on the elevator, I decide I'm going to go to the floor he was on.
Oh.
And so, I saw on the elevator indicator the floor that the elevator was stuck on, right? So I hit his floor. And so when I come off his floor, I smell, of course, the smell of burning human flesh, which I had never smelled before. And so I assumed that that's just what the hotel smells like.
Or maybe they had a restaurant on that floor.
Or they had a restaurant, right? And they were serving pork that day. So it was like the smell of chicken fat was burning. I suspect what I was smelling was the smell of their pubic hair burning. Because he had taken their heads, obviously it wasn't their head hair.
Yeah.
And very shortly after that, I began to smell the paint, house paint burning.
Oh.
And it started getting misty, and there were little sooty flakes in the air, and then the alarms go up. There was no sprinkler system.
Oh.
And so we're evacuated, and I go out to the street as the fire department is coming up, and of course, I'm not going to stay at this hotel.
It's just too busy.
Yeah, just too busy, and I don't like the fire safety code here. So the next morning, I get to, while I was in New York, I get to the lobby of the place I was supposed to be in the next morning, and there are newspapers in the waiting room. And I look at the front pages, and two female torsos set afire, and I see it's the hotel that I was trying to check in the other day. I had known what was going on, right? The guy on the elevator, I completely forget about him. My story when I come home back to Toronto was how I was checking into a hotel where someone had set two torsos on fire. The guy that annoyed me on the elevator and hit me with the bowling balls was not part of that story at all. Not part of even that memory. He was like in some other memory bank, in the irrelevant memory bank. My whole story begins, right, with by coming to the hotel and no rooms being available and thinking, am I going to take a look around, and getting on the elevator and the doors opening and the smell hitting me. The guy, my looking at him, all that, what he looked like, all that is completely out of my memory. Until a year later that year, the next year, he's arrested. And I see his picture. And I recognize him by his haircut, because his haircut was so hideous. I just remember this haircut. Right? I don't remember his face. I remember that he had he was perspiring. There was like a sheen. He was shining with like this perspiring sheen, and that his eyes were looking straight through me like he was in some kind of a daze. And he kind of walked through me as if I was a ghost. You know, we were kind of like moving around. Are you going to get off first? Shouldn't you get off first? Am I going to go left, right? Are you going to pass by me? What the fuck? All right, that little dance, I'm getting on the elevator, so get the fuck off. You go first. What are you waiting for? He looked to me like a office worker, which is exactly what he was. He was killing these women on his lunch breaks or after his evening shift. He was a computer programmer at Blue Shield in Manhattan. He lived with a wife and two kids, or he was divorced now from a wife and two kids in New Jersey. And he killed, I think in the end, he killed 8 women, if I'm not mistaken. Some of them were hookers, some of them were not. He had 2 girlfriends in Manhattan, both nurses.
Oh, really?
Steady job. He worked at, Blue Cross Blue Shield, a very lucrative job at a time, when computer programming, data entry was, you were like a god. Right? He's talking about the 1970s, 1980s. He begins actually, I think, late 1960s. He's there for a good 18 years or something. I wrote about him in Lee Meller's Serial Killer Quarterly. The last issue out, the spring issue, quite a detailed account of Richard Cottingham. He became known as the Times Square Ripper. And these two women were December of '79. There were he killed, I think, 3 more women after this, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, amazing. What caught me was your female serial killer book as well. Do you find a difference in the way female serial killers go about their job?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They're much more neater than men. They waste a lot less time. There's a lot less signature in female murders. Because the men, they gotta first of all, they have to abduct their women, their victims, right? Whether it's male or female. Then they have to restrain them, torture them, rape, fool around with the corpse after, maybe harvest body parts, take pictures, videos, dress the corpse up, eat parts, whatever they're depending on the profile. All this stuff that is unnecessary to the actual death of the victim. The female serial killer, none of this. Her entire gratification comes going straight for the kill. Right? The only exception is female serial killers working in tandem with males. Right? Where the female serial killer begins to kind of reflect the male pathology. But for the female serial killer, her satisfaction comes directly from the kill. But the motive, interestingly enough, is pretty much the same as for male serial killers. Control. Most serial homicides are about control. And that's equal for females as it is for males. The difference is in how females express their need for control. And so the closest we might come to a kind of a male pathology in female serial killers is perhaps females that use poison, but they poison their victims slowly. And so the pain they cause, the torture they cause through the use of poison, of watching their victims suffer, sometimes weeks or even months of being poisoned, maybe is the closest to male pathology. But otherwise, females just go straight for the kill, no fooling around, no playing around with the victim.
They tend to know their victims more.
That's a mythology too now, today, statistically.
Yeah.
Female serial killers are killing strangers. Marginally, there's a preference for strangers. It's marginal.
Yeah.
So the idea that female serial killers somehow seduce a male victim that is either a lover or an intimate is also a great myth. The Black Widow. Way over more than half of female serial killers have killed at least one other woman or have killed a child. So this idea that, and of course it garners a lot of sympathy for female serial killers. The idea that female serial killers are essentially only attacking their male partners or companions or husbands, and that their motive is profit, or as feminism would like to, radical feminism would like to claim that they're defending themselves against male abuse or against the patriarchy or against a phallocentric patriarchy, or it's gynocide, it's defense against gynocide, all this bullshit, right? Radical feminism hates my book. Especially when I point out that more than half of these female offenders, as I said, have killed other women and children. because it completely flies into the face that all female serial killers are victims of the male patriarchy.
Yeah. Do you see the... how do you say this? Do you see the type of serial killer changing in modern times?
Yes, constantly evolutionary. It's a social thing. The serial killers, of course, with the invention, of course, of the word serial killer, which enters our popular vocabulary only in 1981. Right? I traced it back to the New York Times. And so our first serial killer to be called as such, named as such publicly, because the word is used in police community and law enforcement community for at least a decade prior. But in our public knowledge, the first time someone is described as a serial killer is Wayne Williams in the spring of 1981. That's our first American, quote, serial killer. New York Times starts using that term. And serial murder, serial homicide, serial killing. So even, Anne Rule's book, the one we would say is the seminal description of a serial killer, Ted Bundy, The Stranger Beside Me, when we think of the next generation of serial killer, the post-Jack the Ripper era of serial killers, the post-modern serial killer. She doesn't use that word, serial killer. It never appears in The Stranger Beside Me, because her book comes out in 1980. In fact, it's the first book that I read about when I wanted to know what it was that I had encountered in New York. The first book I turned to that describes somebody like that was Anne Rule's book, Stranger Beside Me. Wonderful book. She just passed away recently, too.
Yeah.
So, that term gives us now a model. And so when you ask me if serial killers are changing, indeed they are. They now have role models who have been named. The word now is there. And so serial killers not only look towards other serial killers, but I think we have cases where serial killers met each other in prison, and one emulated the other, and discipled with serial killers, and they know, when the BTK killer was arrested, Dennis Rader, he had my book in his possession. It had just come out. And so he was reading about himself in my book and comparing himself to other serial killers as I was writing about, their history. And we do see new serial killers. I mean, most recently in Canada, the case of the Colonel. I mean, here you have a whole new pathology that we can't quite fit into another profile. I mean, here's a serial killer who is very effective, who, was flying the Queen of England around and the Prime Minister. If he was an American, he'd be at the flight deck of Air Force One.
Right, yeah.
And he starts killing, if indeed these are the first time he's caught, he starts killing very late in his history, in his 40s. I mean, the average starting age for a serial killer is 27, 28 years old. And there is no history of any kind of delinquent behavior, none that has surfaced. And so it's a whole new pathology that we haven't quite seen, like Andrew Cunanan was in a certain way, that kind of weird, almost rampage type serial killer. I mean, Andrew Cunanan goes for weeks and weeks killing people, but he never returns to his identity. So, he could have killed all those people in one day, or he could have killed all those people in 3 days. Like the Washington, Malvo, the Washington Beltway snipers too. Yeah. They never return to their identities. But they're not like a school shooter either. I describe them as rampage serial killers. There's other descriptions right now. So serial killers learn. And serial killers, of course, are in a way products of society as well. They're products of a culture. And serial killers, we've got to remember, they're formed as children. And so when you want to look at their cultural signature, the impact that culture has on the nature of their crimes, you've got to look not at the culture as it is, but you've got to look at the culture as it was approximately 20 years ago when that serial killer was 5 years old and 7 years old and 8 years old. And so when you look at the killers of the 70s, you got to be looking at the Cold War. You got to be looking at men's magazines, pulp magazines, detective magazines, right? And when you're going to be looking at serial killers in the 2000s, you got to be looking at serial killers in the 60s, the culture in the 60s and 70s. Right? We got to backtrack it, all that.
Yeah.
Today's culture, the internet world, all that is right now steeping the serial killers of the decades coming. The Walking Dead serial killers.
Yeah.
The zombie serial killers. They're coming next. They haven't arrived yet. The apocalypse is coming. Yeah.
You think the evolution then, like the school shooting, the theater shootings, is that kind of a different?
It's something I have not looked at enough. It's something that I've grown up with, knowing about, and a sense of it happening. I mean, for people of my generation, was the Texas Tower shootings that really, for the first time, bring the sense of that kind of out of control mass shooting capability. And of course, then in the 70s, 80s, we have postal workers, McDonald's shootings, and of course the school shootings, kind of the school becomes that venue in the 90s now. But they've always have been around, smaller ways or larger ways. Is that part of the breakdown? It certainly is. I think people are living under greater stress in society. I think people are learning that that's a way you could express that stress as well. There are a lot of Lee Harvey Oswalds out there who really don't, at least, Lee Harvey Oswald maybe didn't have conspiracy theories preventing him from pointing his rifle at a president. School shooters have conspiracy theories preventing them from doing that, so they'll go to a place that's easier to express all that rage, a school. But, theoretically, our world is consistently becoming less violent.
Yeah.
I mean, statistically,
yeah,
with every decade, we become less violent. The techno-humanitarian response, it's a measurable, statistical algorithm that suggests that the more advanced our weapon systems, the more sophisticated and effective our civilizational and institutional instruments of repression of aggression and violence and social control. And it's true. And so no matter how it feels that it's getting more violent,
yeah,
cops are shooting people, people are rioting, and ISIS is beheading people. And yes, you have these intense moments of outbursts of violence that rattle the statistic a little bit. They give anomalies in the arcs.
Yeah.
But basically, when you step back and you look at it, at human evolution from the point that we get from the Stone Age into the nuclear age and the post-nuclear age, statistically, we're becoming less and less and less violent with every day, and our instruments of social control and repression of and suppression and inhibition of violence are increasing. Despite the fact of violent culture, violent video games, violent movies, violent TV, school shootings, the NRA, all that, you know. So it's a very paradoxical world. I mean, everything is being thrown by the fact that we're living in an unprecedented period in our civilization of population growth. And everybody has stopped talking about it because we are reaching now post-critical mass period. We're done. We're doomed. If we today turned off every electrical device and never turned it on again for 20 years and never turned on the engine of another car, never belched another puff of smoke out of any factory, Miami is still going to be underwater in 20 years from now. Nothing is going to change. The apocalypse is coming because we've already rode it with just our human presence on this planet. It's too late. If we do all that, if we adopt all those green measures in the radical form, all that we'll do is maybe shorten the recovery period, where it's going to, you know, roll back the other way, when the glacial ice melts or the heat recedes, whichever it's going to be. And we're still not sure whether this is part of the natural climatic pattern as well, because we don't know what's normal. We still don't know. That's if some virus doesn't take us out, or some bug, right? Because I think before global warming kills us all, it's going to be a mosquito that's going to kill us, you know, or a bird, a bird dropping, you know, or something landing from outer space, or that caldera in Colorado that we're waiting for. That's what, 40,000 years late now? You know, I like the singularity. That's the
only possibility.
Hope that we have. And certainly if you believe in the Snooks-Panoff algorithm, you know, I mean, just recently we were still calling it the curve, and now we call it the Snooks-Panoff vertical. Because it goes vertical, and it goes vertical through 2045. That's 20 years from now. That's when it's, you know, that's when the next evolutionary change should kick in, and the next evolutionary life form, of course, will be immune to a caldera. It will be immune to there being no oxygen. It will be immune to radiation. It will be immune to extreme heat. It will be immune to extreme cold. It will be able to thrive just on sunlight. It won't be immune to the heat of a sun, of a star. But it will be immune to everything that dinosaurs and humans are not immune to even what cockroaches might not be immune to. And so if we could extract our sentience in that way and strip our biological bodies from it and find that technological host for them, then indeed, by 2045, it is conceivable that we will have an evolutionary crisis, and that the next crisis will not be by natural selection, but will be by intelligent design. Certainly if we count digitization of the world as an evolutionary crisis, and industrialization as an evolutionary crisis, and the introduction of agriculture as an evolutionary crisis, our last three evolutionary crises, they already have been by intelligent design. I mean, what is the invention of agriculture but not genetic modification? You know, wheat. So, and Snooks-Panoff curve. It just tells us that every next evolutionary advance is 1/3 of its length than its predecessor. And therefore, if 1950, certainly if we measure North American society, if in 1950 our North American society moves from being more than 50% industrial workers to now more than 50% information workers, clerks and teachers and bureaucrats and lawyers and accountants and so forth, the information age kicks. If that's the next transition, then certainly 2045, where that next pattern curve goes vertical, the technology conceivably could be there. I mean, we already genomed ourselves. We already can clone. So can we now extract our souls? And is our soul and our being, our sentience, some kind of duplicatable chemical process in our brain? If it works like a computer, in the binary form, on or off, is there like a chemistry that leaves an on or off pattern in your brain cells that can be then, liquefied and extracted, liquid intelligence, and then hosted without any kind of biological body. And so the moment we can strip the biology from our sentience, we've cured cancer, we've cured death, and we've, of course, made God obsolete. That's why nobody in America wants to talk about, the singularity. The Russians are sinking billions of dollars into it, because, of course, Russian science, having been protected by atheistic Marxism for a good 70 years, has now not been shocked by the notion of a secular, enlightened concept. And so the Russians are taking the singularity theory very seriously, where the Americans are still only whispering about it, because, my God, if you make death obsolete, it's not eternal life, but maybe people will be able to live for 1 million years or 10,000 years. I imagine everything comes to an end eventually, but it's certainly not going to be, our average 75-year span. So I looked recently at the Russian website, 2045.com, right, where they're raising money for, all these oligarchs who've made their billions in investing in the Russian space program are now pulling their money out of the space program, realizing that, in fact, the Catholic Church might have been right when they convicted Galileo for daring, to suggest that maybe the universe does not center on man, on the planet Earth, on the world, that the sun, in fact, does not orbit Earth, but, Earth orbits the sun. Maybe actually we are the only species as we are in the entire universe. The entire universe is an extension of us. That our function, as the Russians believe, Russian science today, Russian philosophy today, believe that human beings are exactly as the medieval church suggested, at the center of the universe, except that we're the gods. Our human intelligence is intended to overcome the laws of Newtonian thermodynamics that insist that the universe must die, that entropy, heat, death, where everything eventually, through thermodynamics, arrives at the same temperature and therefore has to die. The Russians suggest no. Human intelligence can navigate beyond that. And of course, what greater example of human intelligence unleashing and defying Newtonian laws of thermodynamics than Einstein's theories of relativity and their actual applications in nuclear energy, where you take this inert piece of uranium, a rock, and you unleash this incredible energy that exists in it, imperceptible and untouchable by the Newtonian mathematics, those laws. Breaks the laws. Anything is possible. Even conquest of death.
Well, we'll see if we make it.
Yeah, well, I intend to. They say there are 3 bridges. The first bridge is pharmaceuticals. You extend your life by maybe 5 to 10 years by drugs that are becoming available and have been available. The second bridge, of course, is prosthetics. The artificial heart, the artificial kidney, the artificial lung, the artificial everything that we can still not produce an artificial liver, an artificial pancreas, and implant it effectively. But that'll come in the next 15 years, 20 years. And then finally, the third thing, neuroprosthetic. You now have the artificial brain. And of course, all the kind of mobile issues or mobility issues won't be an issue. It'll just be the memory and sentience issues. So I'm about to be 60. So 3-4 years ago, before I familiarized myself with the singularity, I was thinking, fuck, I'm 60 now. Nobody lives to 120. I'm definitely running on quarter tank. The gas tank has gone below half filled. And I don't know when, but it must have been a good decade ago I went, halfway through. But when I think 2045, I'll be 90. People make it to 90. And I don't have to even make it in good health. I can be in a wheelchair and an iron lung. As long as my mind is intact, I can still make it. I can make it through the apocalypse still, maybe, right? So I'm now going on a big health kick and pharmaceutical kick, trying to cross the first bridge. Let's see if I can still be alive for the second bridge to make it to the third.
As long as the serial killer doesn't get you.
As long as the serial killer doesn't get me, yeah.
Yeah, be careful on what elevator you...
Or I step out in front of a taxi cab, or I'm run over by a horse in Central Park.
Yeah.
I wrote about a guy, I wrote a military history, a guy who goes to battle in 1866. And he survives this horrific battle, and he thrives, and he becomes this wealthy rancher and lives a great life. And he's in his 70s in the 1930s. And he visits New York and he's hit by a taxi and he's killed.
Yeah.
And that's life.
That is.
It is.
It is. Well, but you're living in Canada, so now do you think that you've been doing that editing? I was talking about that earlier before the show.
Yeah.
With for the True Crimes Canada. So you're putting out a series of books. Now, Canadian serial killers. Now, is there more than people think?
Yeah, it's just more than serial killers. We're probably going to be looking at some single cases, and R.J. Parker wrote a book, of course, about the Montreal Massacre, and the story of Lepine, who perpetrated that horrific mass killing. So it's not just serial killers. We're looking at perhaps somebody writing about the Torrey Stafford case, which was a man and a woman who killed only one victim. But serial killers are certainly the superstars of true crime. There are more than we give account for, and Canadian serial killers are strange, and we have new patterns. You were asking again about new profiles. You have the Dexter profile as well. There's now a whole new generation of serial killers coming by who are big fans of Dexter. And so we had this Dexter killer, a guy who actually lured people to a little movie studio he had where he killed a guy, a victim, and he wanted to videotape and make movies, snuff films of killing people. And his big show that he was watching when he was imprisoned, he was begging the courts to allow him to watch the most recent episodes of Dexter that he had missed while he was being held in jail on trial. And then, of course, we had the Luke Magnotta case, where he posted, the necrophile. He posted all the video.
That was pretty horrific.
That was pretty horrific, and of course, but less horrific than the footage that he was emulating, the one coming from Russia. 3 men and a hammer. It's horrific stuff. I don't know if you've seen it.
No.
Where they're beating to death this elderly derelict with a hammer in a park. These kids in the Ukraine, and they're videotaping it on their cell phones. It's a horrific murder. They beat him to death with a hammer and stab him with a screwdriver, and it's all recorded on video. And they're doing this for 4 or 5 minutes. They're just breaking open his head, and as they walk away, he's still alive. He's still trying to hang on to life. And you know, that's why Luke Magnotta, when he calls his One Maniac and an Ice Pick, I think he called it, it's his what's the term? His salute, his ode to Three Men and a Hammer.
Yeah.
So, you know, serial killers are emulating each other. It's like that series that I never could get around to watching a single episode, but I just know the premise of it, the following. You know, that all these serial killers are like pigeons or like whales beginning to radar in on each other. Well, in a way they are. And of course, our world today, the internet has obviously changed serial homicide. You know, even in how they search for victims and how they use the internet and all those things are constantly. As society changes, its monsters do. And that's what serial killers are. The book I'm working on now is called Serial Killer Chronicles, a new history and geography of monsters. Essentially, I'm updating everything that I had written to in The Method and Madness of Monsters, because that book came out in 2004, and so I didn't really have much to say about the 21st century at that point. I mean, because most, you know, when you're dealing with history, most histories are finished, the earliest ones are finished in the previous decade. Statistics don't arrive until a few years later and so forth, and of course, if a book's published in 2004, it means it was written way back in 2002. Right, so the data I'm writing with goes to, you know, still 20th century data. So this is now 15 years later, essentially. I've been updating what the phenomenon is today, which direction it's gone into. But they were always our monsters. I think vampires and lycanthropes, and, you know, werewolves, demons and ghouls were our necrophiles and our sadomasochistic. You know, serial killers are lust killers.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. I wished I could talk longer.
It was great. It was a pleasure anytime.
Don't miss our next episode, Fuels Rush In, or the Star-Spangled Boner.
This conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
My micromechanism thanks you. My computer tapes thank you. And I thank you.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
Turn it off! Turn it off!
I can't believe I ate that whole thing.
You ate it, Ralph.
I can't believe I ate that whole thing.
No, Ralph, I ate it.
I can't believe I ate that whole thing.
Take 2 Alka-Seltzer.